Chapter 9.
Shang!
Meiling screamed. Before her was the wind wielder as she clutched air to herself, pulling and pulling Meiling closer. A knife glinted in her other hand, catching raindrops as they fell, fat and heavy, awaiting her arrival. Suddenly, a loud roar ripped through the air, and a tiger sank its fangs into the wind wielder's thigh. She screamed, and her hold on Meiling broke. Meiling gasped, scrambling to her feet, a hand on the panda as it buried its face into her chest with a whimper. Where was Shang? There, lying on the ground. She choked, running toward him, away from a pulsing wave of heat behind her. She had to get to him, to see if he still lived, if she could help him. Almost there. His eyes were wide in shocked pain, his body and clothes blackened. Either she was crying, or the rain was getting in her eyes.
No, Meiling!
Shang's voice cut through the din behind her.
Get back!
If Shang's body was lying in front of her, why was his voice calling from behind her? She stopped, whirling in confusion. There, still fighting and launching volley after volley of knife-sharp ice, was Shang. His frantic face was set toward her.
Run!
He shouted. She turned back to the dead Shang as his body rippled. Through the rain, a rainbow flickered, just for a second. Realization sunk like lead into the pit of her stomach. A trap for her. The third cloaked figure, nowhere to be seen, was an illusionist. She turned to run just as the illusion flickered out entirely, replaced by a grim man with flashing eyes. A man that was terrifyingly close to her. There was no way she could outrun him. Her feet stuck like roots into the ground, paralyzed. Something whizzed past her ear, breaking her shock. A wretched cry ripped from the illusionist as an ice bolt pierced his thigh and sank deep, blood spattering. Then something ice-cold grabbed hold of her arm and flung her to the side.
Run!
Shang shouted, shoving her hard toward the horses. Get to the horse! Get to the horse! Meiling ran as fast as she could, focused on her goal. The panda whimpered again, and she clutched it tight against her. Almost there. But then, just as she was close enough to reach out and grab the reins, her horse disappeared, vanished, straight into nothing. Meiling choked. She reached for the reins of Fen's horse. It, too, vanished before she could grab hold. Frantically, she turned and found the illusionist still fallen on the ground, but alert and concentrating hard. She gritted her teeth, facing thin air again. It was only an illusion. Only vaguely aware of the struggle behind her, only noticing in her periphery the alternating blasts of hot and cold, she ran forward. Her arms stretched out into nothing until her hands met a solid, coarse, muscular neck. Biting back a cry of relief, Meiling ran her hand through the air, along the invisible beast. The air shuddered and bent slightly, revealing the outline of all three vanished horses. It recovered, but not fast enough. She glanced back at the illusionist to see him standing, clutching his gushing wound. The ice bolt lay on the ground, covered in blood, by his feet. His face was puckered in focus and pain. Meiling ran her hands quickly over the beast until she found the stirrup. Her whole body trembled with terror and adrenaline as she stuck her foot in it. She launched herself with all her might, flinging her other leg over the side of the air. Her judgment had been wrong, and she kicked the saddle. This was so much harder with a panda tied to her front. Biting her lip, she heaved again, and then she was sitting in the saddle. The illusion of her horse flickered enough so she could quickly find the reins. A loud bark sounded. Meiling turned her horse toward the fray to see a wolf attempting to maul the wind wielder. The wolf caught sight of Meiling mounted on air, lifted its ears, and let out a surprised whine. Beneath Meiling, the illusion strengthened. The wind wielder seized her chance. She thrust her clenched hand upward in the air, and Fen gasped, a very un-wolf-like sound, and her wolf shape broke. Fen collapsed to her knees before the Windwielder, clutching her throat, her eyes wide in panic. The Windwielder drew back her knife in a flash. Fen squeezed her eyes shut, and her face turned purple as she tried to break the woman's hold on her breath. "Shang!" Meiling screamed. He had already noticed. He raised his left arm and, with a fierce, swift motion, threw a sheet of ice across the entire town square. Launching a series of ice shards at the Windwielder, he continued blasting the fire wielder with another volley of bolts from his other hand. The woman reacted, gusting away the ice, though not quite fast enough. She must have been hit somewhere because she cried out and slipped on the ice beneath her. Fen gasped and fell. They had to get out of here. They couldn't keep fighting. Everyone was burned or bleeding or exhausted. But if Fen and Shang couldn't see the horses, they couldn't mount in a hurry. The illusionist worked feverishly to slow their escape. Meiling turned her horse back to where the others had been and urged it until it nipped something in front of them. The illusion flickered until the outline of both horses was visible for a split second. She leaned forward and caught the lead of that horse. She squeezed her eyes shut. "The horses are right here," she said, flinging open her eyes in desperation. Fuzzy masses coalesced before her, just enough for her to snatch up the lead for the last horse. The illusion shattered. She rode a solid beast, led two more. Leaning precariously far in the saddle, she smacked the rump of one horse to run toward Fen, who caught hold of the saddle. Fen barely had the strength to hoist herself into it as the Windwielder began pulling her back. The woman screamed again as blood burst on her shoulder. Shang's doing. The wind died in an instant. Fen mounted and turned her horse around.
"Run!"
Shang shouted through the din.
"Take my horse!"
"No!" Fen yelled back. Shang winced as a dart of fire hit his forearm.
"Go!"
Fen and Meiling kicked their horses into a gallop, Meiling still holding the lead of the third horse. Wind tried to snake around them, but it was cut off abruptly. She leaned as close as she could to the horse's neck, holding on for her life and the panda's life. Lightning flashed overhead, and an ear-splitting peal of thunder tore across the world. Everything was wet, wet, wet. The horses galloped through the muddy streets of the village, out into open fields of crops, trampling everything without discrimination. "What about Shang?" Meiling yelled at Fen. She clung to her racing horse, still leading the other galloping one. "He'll be fine," Fen shouted back, but was that uncertainty and fear ringing her pupils? They gave no thought to the fields they ruined. They only pushed their horses as hard as they could. Chills seeped into Meiling's body, despite the heat of the horse beneath her. Her teeth chattered, and her hair plastered to her face. The torrent of rain stung her eyes. Darkness set deeper, so only the lightning flashing overhead illuminated their path. The panda huddled close to her chest, a warm and scared little bundle.
"Give me my horse!"
A shout sounded to Meiling's right. She whipped her head to see Shang zipping alongside them, his feet not seeming to touch the ground. Normally, she would have 1,000 questions. Was he skating? How in the 7 valleys had he caught up to them? But now she could only hold out the lead as she struggled to not fall off her horse. He snatched it away and, though it seemed utterly impossible, managed to mount his horse. Meiling looked behind to see nothing except rain and storm. No pursuers dogged their steps. The relief was so great, she almost loosened her death grip on her horse and plunged to her demise. They were forced to slow when they entered the forest, but eventually the rain lightened to a steady downpour, and the raindrops no longer stung. It might have been hours they rode in the cold, wet darkness. Eventually, Shang called a halt. They reined in their horses, but for a long moment, No one dismounted. Meiling glanced from Fen to Shang to the panda and back again. Fen sagged in her saddle, like she might fall to the ground any minute. Shang breathed heavily, his shoulders slightly bowed, but his eyes glittered in the flashes of stray lightning overhead. Are we camping here?" Meiling stuttered through frozen lips. When Shang didn't answer, she assumed it was a yes. She dismounted, struggling a fair amount with the panda, and almost fell flat on her back, but still managed. She took her horse's lead and approached Shang's horse, holding out her hand for his lead. He stared at her blankly for one long moment, and then slowly dismounted. His clothes were torn where he'd been hit, gaping especially wide around his wounded shoulder. When he handed her the rope, his hand was so cold she almost drew back. "I think Fen might need help dismounting," she said softly. She took both horses to a nearby tree and tied the wet ropes. They could be hobbled later, after she dealt with their more pressing matters, like how they were going to sleep in this rain. Shang placed another lead in her hand wordlessly. Fen's arm was slung around his neck, but he hardly seemed to be supporting her. He lowered her to a patch of ground that was grassier than the others. And then, to Meiling's surprise, he knelt in the rain, his lips thinning with concentration, and slid his hands up from the ground. Under his movements, ice appeared, flowing from his fingertips, round, extremely thick, and large enough for the three of them. He was fashioning a shelter of ice. She stared. Fen gave a shuddering laugh. "Never battle Shang during a storm," she croaked. Meiling tilted her head, furrowing her brow. Images of him fighting flickered across her mind. How had he been able to fight 3 powerful wielders at a time? He'd been so restless and anxious from the storm, and now, despite his exhaustion, he was still using his magic. That sort of power was unlike anything she'd seen before. Had the storm made him that powerful? Instead, she asked, "Is there any way to start a fire in this rain?" "Maybe," Fen answered, wincing as she spoke. "Pine needles dry fast. Bark usually is dry on one side. Some wood under fallen logs might be dry, but it's a long shot." Meiling pursed her lips, running her hand up and down the panda's back to comfort it. It still hadn't stopped cowering, and she didn't blame the poor thing. Shivering, she pulled her cloak tighter around them both. Pine needles, bark, wood under fallen logs.
"Meiling,"
came Shang's low voice. She glanced back. He winced as he got to his feet, straightening to his full height in the darkness. "Yes?"
"I'll do it. Go inside the shelter."
He might be standing strong now, but he could topple at any minute. She shook her head. "I will be back shortly. I won't go far."
"Meiling."
Setting her jaw, she marched away, wishing not for the first time that she'd been born a fire wielder. It would make this situation much less complicated. Then again, if she'd been born a fire wielder, they wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. The panda let out a little whimper. "Don't worry, we'll have a nice fire going soon. Then we can all warm up." She stroked its head and barely pulled her hand back in time to keep from being bitten. "But you need to behave." She started by peeling bark off a few different trees, but everything was soaked through. Gritting her teeth against the cold, she searched further, glancing back every few minutes to make sure she wasn't wandering too far. A bolt stabbed through her heart at the thought of getting lost. She quickly dismissed it. If she screamed, Shang would hear her. Her boot kicked a stone. A very large stone. Meiling looked up. and found herself standing before what seemed to be the remains of an enormous stone building. What in the 7 valleys? Her breathing quickened with hope, and she moved faster, dodging around collapsed and half-buried stones, until she found a sheltered section with a roof and walls. Better yet, the ground was littered with dry brush.
Meiling!
Came a distant call. Shang. Here! She shouted back, and the panda grunted in annoyance. Wrapping herself up against the rain, she hurried back the way she'd come. When she reached the horses, Shang was gripping his arm beneath the burn. His shoulders sagged, and he dropped his hand when she came into view.
There you are.
I didn't go far, she said, blinking against the droplets falling into her eyes. I found a shelter where we can stay. There's plenty of brush. It's just ahead, a short distance. The darkness made it hard to read his expression.
Show me,
he said with a grunt, untying the horse's leads.
If it is good, I'll come back and get Fen.
Meiling led the way, trying not to shiver. Is she all right?
She'll be fine.
What about you? She wanted to ask. When they reached the ruins, Shang let out another grunt, clambering over fallen stones behind Meiling until they reached the part still standing. He ducked beneath the stone roof, through a curtain of dripping rainwater. See? She said, kicking the small sticks and brush littering the ground. She led him past the half-collapsed sections to the mostly enclosed room she'd found. A room plenty big for the 3 of them and the panda. Shang gave a single nod of approval that probably made Meiling's stomach warm more than it should have.
Will you start the fire while I fetch Fen?
She gave him her affirmation and hurried to comply, mostly because she was frozen and dying for a scrap of warmth. Not to mention it about killed her that the cub shivered against her. It took some time to retrieve the tinderbox from Fen's saddlebags and collect a pile of brush and small sticks for the fire. Some of it wasn't as dry as she hoped, but surely she could get it to light, right? As she pulled the steel and flint from the box, Shang helped Fen into the room and leaned her against the frigid stone wall. Then he collapsed beside her with a groan, his head falling back. Meiling's fingers shook as she struck the steel and flint for a spark. The brush was still too wet, and the sparks wouldn't catch. It was a challenge to see over the top of the panda's head, but she couldn't set it down for fear it would be too cold. She hoped her silent companions weren't paying her any heed, like they usually did. Swallowing her frustration, she struck harder, again and again. Her hands would not stop trembling from cold and aftershock. Phoenixes scorch it all. Her grip slipped. She let out a small cry, dropping the flint as blood welled and spilled over her hand. She'd cut open 2 fingers. Looking up, she found Fen curled in a wet, freezing lump against the wall, utterly oblivious. But Shang's black eyes had seen her carelessness. The heat of embarrassment burned her cheeks. Her companions had wounds she needed to tend. Shang's tunic had been entirely burned away on one shoulder, and his other arm looked black where the flame dart had struck him. Not to mention Fen, who'd nearly had her life sucked out of her by the wind wielder and might have other wounds besides. They'd worked so hard for her to escape unscathed, and she caused injury to herself just by trying to light a fire.
Bring it here.
Shang's low voice sounded. Meiling's face flushed deeper, making her cheeks tingle in the cold. I'll bind it. It isn't deep, she said, shrugging against the pain. He eased back against the wall, keeping his eye on her and the fire she was trying to light. She clutched her fingers to her chest and asked, "Which horse has the bandages?"
Mine,
he responded. Meiling nodded and got to her feet to brave the rain. Shang had tied the horses beneath the stone overhang, giving them shelter from the drizzle and piling their saddles to the side. She found the medical kit wrapped tightly in one saddlebag. Thank the fathers it was dry. She grabbed a sack of food and 2 canteens of water as well, then made her way back into the shelter, wetter than before. Her blood dripped on the medical kit, smeared her sleeve. A sigh escaped her lips as she pulled the gauze from the pack and settled on the ground beside the pile of kindling. "Knife?" she asked. Shang patted his belt and frowned.
I lost one,
He muttered to himself, and then pulled a small one from his boot. He held the blade and offered her the hilt. She took it and quickly cut a strip of bandage. After pouring water from her water skin on the cut, she proceeded to fumble with the gauze, wrapping it around her still bleeding fingers. The cut was deeper than she realized, and it stung more with every passing minute. Blood dripped onto her sash holding the panda and dribbled down her knuckles.
You'll bind it poorly with one hand,
Shang said.
Come here.
She wanted to draw back, to insist she could do it, but he was right. Wounded pride was preferred to foolishness. She scooted closer to Shang, holding out the gauze and offering her fingers. Wordlessly, he took her palm and tilted her hand so he could squint at the cuts. He bound them carefully and wiped away the smearing blood, despite how his icy hands shook as he worked. Did his skin almost tingle against hers? Perhaps an after effect of using so much magic? Once he was finished, however, he didn't let go of her hand. He pulled it closer, frowning as he turned it over, inspecting it carefully. She said nothing, merely canting her head to one side as her eyes flitted from the knot between his brow to the bandage on her fingers. "What are you doing?" she wanted to ask. He gestured for her other hand, and she hesitantly obliged. He subjected this one to the same scrutiny as the first. Why did it feel like he read all her secrets in the lines of her palm, the creases of her knuckles? Why did she feel so oddly exposed?
No scars,
he said quietly, almost disbelievingly. She bit her lip, a pang hitting her in the chest. She tugged gently on her hands, and his eyes shot up to hers, so large and black in the dimness. He released her, and she wrapped her arms around her panda as she shivered with cold and relief. "Of course I don't have scars," she forced herself to say. "I didn't go to the academy." She couldn't quite bring herself to say, "I have no magic." Yet even so, the words rung in the air, full of deception. Did he hear the unspoken falsehood? That gaze meeting hers was too impenetrable to imagine his thoughts. He'd overcome his disbelief at the sight of her hands, and it made her wonder if he'd ever seen hands that weren't riddled with scars, surrounded as he'd always been by magic wielders.
You will have scars now,
he said. Her heart stuttered. Did he know she had magic? Did he suspect? It wasn't until his eyes shifted to the bandage on her fingers that she realized what he meant. Pursing her lips, she turned back to the fire, taking much more care with striking the flint. It wouldn't light, not until it occurred to her to use a piece of gauze to catch the spark. This time, after a few strikes, the fire caught. She blew on it carefully, coaxing it until it crackled and spat. She held her shivering hands as close to the flames as she could, extra cautious with the bindings on her fingers. But she could not linger, no matter how exhausted and cold she was. She had more work to do. She peeled off her wet cloak and laid it near the fire to dry. The shelter was already warmer, despite the frigid stone. Untying her soaked sash, she set the panda down on the ground, and it huddled in a little ball of fur by the fire. Lucky thing didn't have wet clothes to worry about like the rest of them. Meiling held out the little sack of food to Shang. His eyes had closed, so she said, "Eat." They flashed open, meeting hers. Firelight gleamed in those dark pupils. He accepted the sack, but did not open it. She frowned. Now, by the glow of the dancing flames, Shang looked even worse than she'd realized. He'd been cut above his eyebrow, his shoulder burn moist and blistering, with his hair and clothes singed. She couldn't help her grimace as she gathered the gauze, knife, and medical kit. "Let me tend your shoulder." He shook his head slowly. Meiling shuffled to his side and leaned forward anyway, her hands outstretched.
No,
Shang barked, immediately drawing backward. She lowered her brow in a glare. "You forget I come from a family of fire-wielders. I will not hurt you." Her soft tone turned earnest. "Trust me, Shang." That steely gaze held hers and slowly melted, enough for the pain and exhaustion plaguing him to shine through. Defeated, he exhaled and closed his eyes. With a determined set of her jaw, Meiling reached for the ties of his cloak. He flinched, turning his face away from her, but didn't stop her. As she peeled off his cloak, she tried to ignore the way his chest rose and fell swifter with each breath, as if it took every ounce of his self-control not to jerk away from her. She paused, suddenly embarrassed to attempt removing his outer robes. But she needed to help him, personal embarrassment notwithstanding. He spared her, however, leaning forward and shrugging his good arm out of the sleeve. The other arm required more help, and his jaw tightened as she carefully eased the fabric away from the burn. It landed with a sodden smack on the ground, pooling at his waist. His garments were soaked through to his skin, and his tunic clung to the toned muscles of his torso. He braced himself, but a shiver escaped him anyway. She took the knife and slowly began cutting away the fabric around the burn. She should ask him to remove his shirt entirely, both to aid in treatment and warming him up, but the movements would be too hard on the injury, especially where his shirt stuck to his wound. So she cut around the area until the burn had space to breathe. She worked carefully, refusing to be clumsy despite her own chill. She rummaged through the sack until she found the salve she needed. Slowly, despite Shang's winces, she gently rubbed it into the burn, avoiding the blisters. "This should provide relief," she mumbled. Once she was done, she unwrapped a long stretch of gauze and began binding the wound. His eyes remained closed, squeezing tightly every so often in pain. Meiling bit her lip when he cringed. She tied off the bandage. "Now your other arm." He said nothing, merely unfolding it from his waist and turning it so she could access the wound. She set to work. The dart had only grazed him, so the burn wasn't nearly as bad as his shoulder. Within a few minutes, it was bound as well. "Any others?" Shang opened one eye, closed it, and shook his head. A cursory glance revealed no other injuries besides the shallow cut on his forehead. Was it still bleeding? She leaned closer, trying to get a better look. Carefully, she brushed her thumb just above the cut. His eyes snapped open, arresting her so suddenly that she froze, her thumb still hovering at his skin. She'd been so focused on whether he was hurt or not that she hadn't realized how close her face was to his, how her mouth drifted so near his own. He caught her wrist, quickly averting his gaze and swallowing.
it's fine.
Meiling drew back. He released his grip immediately. She shifted toward Fen, attempting to disguise her flush by untying the shifter's sopping cloak and setting it near the fire to dry. Fen startled awake, growling wordlessly. "You'll catch cold," Meiling whispered. "Come closer to the fire. Are you bleeding or burned?" Fen obeyed, crawling so close to the fire that Meiling put out a hand to keep her from drawing too near. "Just bruised," she muttered. "I've never... They were..." "It's all right," Meiling said. "You fought bravely, and we escaped. That's all that matters. Here, eat something. Sleep." "Someone has to stand guard," Fen protested, her eyes clearing in the firelight. "I'll guard. Go to sleep." Fen's face twisted in confusion, but she needed no more encouragement. She curled up near the fire, the color finally returning to her face, and slept. The panda cub scooted against her legs, laying its head on top of her knee before yawning and letting out a huff. It promptly fell back asleep. Everyone was asleep and tended to. The fire started, the horses sheltered. It may not have all been done as well as if Shang had done it, but it would have to do. Now that everything was taken care of, Meiling's shoulders dropped with exhaustion. She was wearier than she'd ever been in her life. Her fingers burned where she had cut them, and her eyelids dragged with heaviness. She lay down in a shivering bundle near the fire and let her spirit fly free. Chapter 10. All night, Meiling guarded the campsite, hunting for the glow of souls, and occupied herself with distressing turns of thought. Brigands. Those wielders who had attacked them were brigands, criminals who exercised their magic outside the Emperor's sanction. But who were they? And why had they come for her? Why had that Evanescer come for her at the palace? This wasn't mere coincidence. They had to be connected, which meant that someone was trying to take her. But how would they already know she had fled the palace, much less tracked her down? It seemed impossible. No one knew about this except her parents, Fen and Shang. Unless the fact that Fen and Shang had been dropped from their appointments raised suspicion. She dropped her face into her hands. This was too confusing. How was she to make sense of this by herself? As Meiling floated through the dying storm, free of the chill of her body, she tried to piece everything together. They hadn't tried to kill her. That was obvious. They wanted to kill Fen and Shang, her protectors. They wanted to kidnap Meiling. How else could she explain the fact that she had not been killed? She'd been next to helpless, with no weapon and no skills in self-defense, all while carrying a father's cursed panda cub, no less. If someone wanted her alive, what use could they have of her? Perhaps her royal blood was intended to be used as leverage, as a means of power in negotiation to make her father capitulate to demands. Or perhaps someone had learned the secret of the cursed princess, that she wasn't as magicless as everyone thought. But how? A sudden thought seized her. Was her use of her magic even now? Was it illegal? She was not a sanctioned magic wielder. She was not employed in the service of the Empire. That hadn't seemed to matter before. But now... Dread settled into the pit of her soul. That explained Pa's last warning to her, not to tell anyone about her magic. If she did, if someone found out, she could be tried for treason, burned as a criminal, or slow-sliced to death. Not even her Pa could circumvent the law, not unless he wanted to sacrifice his entire family to execution. She'd be a brigand. Or was she already that? She shuddered at the thought. She may not be like the brigands who'd attacked them, but that did not make her magic use legal. Whatever the case, she couldn't tell Shang or Fen. She couldn't tell anyone. She must hope that Shang and Fen would defend her from these mysterious enemies, get her to the fortress, and that her parents would quickly make the palace safe enough for her to brave the return journey. Then she would resume her life as the cursed princess, such as it was. Meiling did not wake Fen and Shang in the morning as the sky brightened. She rose early, stoked the fire, and did what she could to prepare for the day's travel. If Fen and Shang were well enough to travel. The panda remained curled in the crook of Fen's knees, but it watched Meiling's movements, its rounded ears twitching. There was nothing to be had for a warm meal, but maybe there was something else besides rice cakes and jerky. She ducked out of the shelter quietly. In daylight, it was easier to see the stretch of tumbled stones for quite some distance. Fallen, broken pillars lay half buried by dirt, with scraggly shrubs forcing their way up between crackled paving stones. Temple ruins, perhaps? She almost rolled her ankle, stumbling through the rocky remains to the horse's saddlebags piled near the animals. Her horse whinnied softly and nuzzled its face under her shoulder. There, my sweet one," she chuckled. "Don't turn invisible on me today, all right?" She stroked the horse's gray neck, admiring the beast's elegant stature that belied its graceful power. How majestic a horse was! She liked hers especially. Something about it belonging to her made it even more beautiful. She didn't neglect the other horses, however, and took a few minutes to give each of them a little love and affection. It garnered mixed receptions from the animals. When she rummaged through the saddlebags, she was surprised to find what she was looking for: a small pot and tea leaves. Quietly returning to her sleeping companions, she made the tea and silently bemoaned her lack of a strainer for the leaves. She was carefully pouring the tea back into one of the water skins when Shang's voice startled her, making her spill a few drops.
"It's so late!"
He jerked up from the ground and winced at the movement. His shirt had dried in the night, and it hung stiffly on his frame, the cut hole showing the bandage and just a tad of muscular chest and arm.
"What are you doing? We must be—"
"You needed rest," Meiling said. "How's your arm?" She handed him the water skin. "Drink." He eyed it suspiciously.
"What is it?"
Did he think she was trying to poison him? Why in the Seven Valleys would she do such a thing when she was all but helpless in this wild, maguey-ridden countryside? "Tea," she said, pressing it into his hands with a slightly annoyed cock of her eyebrow. She tossed him a hunk of traveler's bread. "How is your shoulder?" He caught the bread and took one swig of the hot tea, then another.
"Better,"
he grunted. She smiled. "I'm glad to hear it. I will be back shortly. There's a stream nearby, and the horses will be desperate for water by now."
"Don't go,"
Shang said immediately. Meiling paused, pulling at one of her sleeves self-consciously. "Why?"
"You have no protection,"
he said, as if it were the most obvious thing ever.
"No magic."
Did he suspect her? Despite her rising alarm, she clenched her teeth and stared back at those calculating black irises, as if his words had no effect on her. It's mid-morning. The sun is bright. Little mischief happens at such times. You and Fen are not recovered. I'll be quick. His face darkened as the sun streamed in between the gaps of stone and cast bright rays across the ground. He quickly disguised any grimace as he sat forward.
"Mischief? I suppose you mean like last night?"
Meiling would have grinned her own mischievous smile, but she kept her face calm and determined. "I'll be quick," she repeated, and scurried out of the shelter, ignoring his further protests. She shook her head as she knelt to unbuckle the 3 horses' hobbles. The leather was stiff from drying in a knot, and the task proved especially difficult with her 2 fingers bound in a bandage. Her fingernails were red and stinging by the time she loosened all 3 beasts and collected their leads. The 3 horses followed her with ears cupped forward as she led them toward the stream she'd seen last night while floating. If she was correct, it was not too far away, just a little in that direction there. The sound of rushing water was her first indication that she'd chosen the right direction. The mud was the second. Her boots slugged in the wet ground whenever she did not take care to search for the grassy spots. Fenn's horse kept stopping to lower its head and chew vacantly at the bright green stalks. "Ah, come, you stubborn thing!" She tugged its lead and its ears went back. It swished its tail, glaring stupidly at her, and then followed with stomping hooves. The stream was flooding. It was much wider and swifter than last night. The engorged stream nearly swallowed up the bank, and she was forced to take great care with each step. She tied the horses to a tree branch close to the water and let the parched horses drink their fill. While they lapped, she precariously slogged her way to a dry, grassy spot overlooking the stream. Her boots were filthy, with large, squishy chunks of mud lining the edges and smearing up the sides. She plopped down on the grass and smiled. There was something about sitting in a place like this, with the sun beating down on her, the wind ruffling her hair and caressing her cheek, letting her eyes feast on the beauty of the green forest and the sparkling, gurgling stream. That was so much better when she was awake. She pulled her messy, tattered braid over her shoulder and unwound it leisurely, letting her fingers linger on the softness of its silky texture. For just a single minute, she let her hair fly free in the wind. It made her feel a little wilder and a little freer. Practicality quickly won over sentiment, and she braided it again. Something moved on the other side of the stream. She leaned forward, sitting up in a crouch, eyes squinting. A chattering sound made the horses whinny, stomp their legs, and flatten their ears. Except Fenn's, which continued drinking. She held completely still. Something red scurried beneath the underbrush, and then a flash of brilliant blue. She drew in a sharp breath, eyes flying wide. Oh, fathers! Heart beating fast, she scanned the surrounding area, searching for an escape route. Why hadn't she listened to Shang? She should have waited until he could accompany her or let him do it himself. She had no way to defend herself, or the horses. They were even more helpless than her, tethered at the edge of the water. She certainly was not about to leave them there and flee for help. Slowly, each movement deliberate, she slid from the grassy perch to the mud on the bank of the stream. As she moved, one of the hidden creatures chortled. She froze. It darted out to the water, in full view of her. Its body was the size of a dog, long and sinuous. Red, glittering scales ran the length of its thin reptilian body. The creature spotted the horses with gleaming golden eyes and reared back on its hind legs, flexing waxy, almost translucent wings. It spat warning puffs of smoke at the horses, which pulled at their leads and brayed anxiously. A dragon. Meiling's focus did not leave the dragon as she moved steadily closer. Her hands went clammy, but she dared not move to wipe them on her garments. The Mwagwe ignored her and seemed torn between intimidating the horses and getting its drink. Its forked tongue slid between sharp teeth and curled in the rushing currents of the bloated stream. She slipped in the mud and flailed her arms to catch herself. Golden eyes snapped to hers. She froze, even as her foot kept sliding ever so slightly in the muck. She barely managed to trap her scream behind gritted teeth and a braced jaw. The dragon screeched, flapping its wings, and spit little bursts of flame, still warning, but threatening. "Shh, my beautiful one," Meiling said, her hands outstretched toward the creature on the opposite bank. "I mean you no harm. I just need to get my friends here, and then I'll leave you alone. How's that?" She smiled with closed lips so the dragon would not see her teeth and misinterpret her gesture. "I won't tell the others." As she spoke, she continued her slow trek toward the horses. She cooed sweet words, and the dragon's wings drooped slightly. It cocked its lizard-like head at her, and its tongue flickered. When she touched the first horse, the dragon screeched again. "Hush!" she cried, still softly. "They'll hear you and they'll kill you. I don't want you to kill me or my friends here, and I don't want my other friends to kill you. So stay quiet, stay on your side of the water, and don't blast us with fire, all right?" She smiled her tight-lipped smile again, biting back a whimper of fear. The dragon blinked its cat's eyes at her, thrice in quick succession, and cocked its head to the side. Then it scooted further down the stream, away from them, and with a wary eye on Meiling, began drinking. She quickly untied the horses and began clambering up the bank with the 3 beasts in tow. The dragon, alerted by their movement, puffed out its chest again and spread its wings, but did no more. When they were a safe distance away, it lowered itself to the water again. Meiling breathed a long sigh and nearly collapsed in relief. But she gritted her teeth, dragged Fen's horse away from another snack, and squared her shoulders to face the others. "See?" she said when she entered the ruins to find Shang working to disguise signs of their occupation. "Nothing terrible happened." Hopefully, her smile didn't look too awkward or tense. He looked up, his expression taking on the cold indifference she had grown accustomed to. He wore a fresh tunic, not the one she'd cut up last night. One glance at him, and she could hardly believe he had been so badly burned yesterday. Either his pain tolerance was very high, or that salve had worked faster than expected. Possibly both.
"We're leaving,"
Shang said.
"Fen's been repacking the saddlebags."
"Where's the panda?"
"Don't know, don't care."
She shot him a glare before hurrying to find Fen, who was sitting beside the pile of saddlebags, the panda sprawling between her legs. The shifter rubbed the cub's lower abdomen, a focused line appearing between her eyes, her tongue sticking out between her lips. "Do you feel better?" Meiling asked. "Can't you see I'm busy?" Fen growled, and then yelped as the panda let out a happy chirp, flapping its arms toward her. Meiling hid a smile. Fen was fine, it seemed. When she turned to leave, something hit the back of her head and fell over her, blocking her vision. She threw up her arms, scrambling to pull the fabric away from her head, only to discover it was her cloak. "That's yours," said Fen from behind her with a little snicker. Meiling tamped down on the sudden bubbling of irritation inside her chest. She didn't bother responding, instead merely clasping the cloak around her throat and marching away. Of course, Fen wouldn't be different after last night. Meiling had thought they'd be more of a team now, but apparently that was a flawed assumption. Fen would be Fen, and that was that. Within a few minutes, after Shang finished disguising the area as their campsite and the horses were resaddled, they mounted. Fen had the panda tied to her front, its arms and legs free to flop at its side.
"You need to get rid of that thing,"
Shang growled at her.
"It's nothing but a liability."
"His name is Bo," replied Fen haughtily. "And his wound isn't fully healed yet." Shang said nothing more, coming to Meiling's side to hoist her into the saddle. She merely smiled sweetly at his hard face. "I think I can do it," she said. He blinked. Then he twisted on his heel and, in one deft movement, leapt into his horse's saddle. He didn't even look over his shoulder to see whether she got along or not. She did. After a few deep breaths, after her heart rate skyrocketed, after she nearly fell just from getting her foot in the stirrup, she mounted her horse. She did it, albeit not gracefully. "What are you smiling about?" Fen asked sourly. Meiling grinned. "It's a beautiful day." And each day, she was stronger than the day before. Chapter 11. "There was something strange about those brigands," Fen said to Shang while she let the panda gnaw on her hand. "They weren't employed in the Emperor's service, obviously, but it wasn't just that. Their magic felt unnatural." Meiling's head cocked at this. "What do you mean?" Fen cast an irritated look over her shoulder, as if she hadn't expected Meiling to be listening. "If you had magic, Princess, you'd feel the difference. Magic flows. Theirs was forced, like their magic wasn't their own."
"Or not entirely their own,"
Shang said coolly. He turned in his saddle to give Meiling a pointed look, as if he expected her to know something about it. Her face must have reflected her bafflement, because he narrowed his eyes and turned ahead. He hadn't forgotten about the inn, then. They traveled along the stream Meiling had visited earlier, and she prayed desperately that they would not come upon any of the dragons from earlier. She wasn't sure exactly why she wanted her little dragon spared. They were dangerous. Yet something about that one's golden eyes made her think it did not want to be a threat to human civilization. It only wanted to be left alone. The horse's hooves sunk into the rain-softened ground, a safe distance from the swell of the stream. Each step was a pop, like the mud was not ready to relinquish its hold. Squelch, 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 they traveled in the sunlight. The world was more beautiful after a storm, Meiling decided firmly. "Not entirely their own," Fen repeated. "How so?"
"Her Highness the Queen probably has a theory or two,"
Shang said, his head tilting slightly in Meiling's direction again. Her focus snapped sharply. "My mother? What would she know?"
"She never told you about her friend from her academy days?"
Shang asked, peering at her with that dangerous glint. The implication of that word friend made her stomach sink like a rock in a lake, stunning her into silence. Had there been someone before Pa?
"So she has told you something."
He did suspect her. Surely that was what that slow, calculating smile meant. He'd tucked away her knowledge of their pursuers, and he was determined to discover her. He baited her, waiting for her to falter, and when she did, he would do something. What could he gain from unraveling any mystery shrouding the shamed princess? Perhaps he intended to leverage his knowledge of her secrets or crimes, whichever he discovered. Could he blackmail her? Force her to gather information, say or do something she did not want, or something worse? He was ambitious, determined, and cunning. But how vicious was he? What was he willing to do to accomplish his goals? Despite everything, Fen and Shang clearly still hated her. She'd been a fool to think she'd made progress with them. "She has told me nothing," Meiling said. "I know nothing of what you speak." Shang didn't believe her. It was plain on his face, in the twist of his lips. His distrust carved itself into every line of his handsome face. He thought her a liar. Meiling dug her nails into the pommel of her saddle. "The Queen? What does she have to do with anything?" Fen asked Shang, completely ignoring Meiling. When he didn't answer, she peppered him with variations of the same question. He let out an annoyed breath and flicked his gaze to her.
The Queen has little to do with anything. Rumor has it that she was friends with one who defected from the Academy. One defect who is causing a stir in the barbarians amassing in the north.
Where did you hear this? Fen hurled the question at him. We had the same masters, and they definitely did not cover this in our classes.
Independent research,
Shang said. Inside, Meiling's hackles raised, and despite her lack of battle training, she almost wanted to sling a punch at Shang for speaking of her mother like she was some enemy spy. No one was better or more loyal than her mother. For one with a shoulder that must be hurting even now, Shang sat with his back straight in his saddle. Despite the underlying accusations of his words, the ones he used were careful and well chosen to appear harmless to anyone but Meiling. She tried not to hate him for the growing number of negative assumptions he made about her and her family. If her father knew how Shang spoke about his wife and daughter, a few words, and Meiling could utterly destroy Shang's life and future. She ground her teeth together and gave her head a little shake. No, she wouldn't stoop so low, even if Shang wasn't suffering from wounds on her behalf. The stream was so glutted after the storm, it could almost be called a river. Meiling tried to distract herself from the burning frustration in her chest with the sights and sounds of rushing water, the towering trees, and the wet foliage that glittered like emeralds. Something scuttled on the opposite bank. Meiling closed her eyes as her heart sank. The dragons were still here. Maybe the others had missed the sound? It was a ridiculous hope. Shang and Fen were warriors, their senses attuned to any suggestion of danger. As if on cue, Fen's head whipped to the side like a dog catching a scent. Dragons. Look, 3 of them. You can get the blue, I'll get the green and yellow ones. Meiling found a strange solace in the fact that her little red one was elsewhere.
There's no need. They haven't seen us, and they won't bother us if we leave them alone,
Shang said, dismissing Fen's eager gaze with a wave of his hand. Those words brought a burst of hope to Meiling's anxious heart. She knew dragons were monsters to be killed, but these seemed almost harmless. Perhaps it was their beauty that made her want to spare them. Not slay them? But they are a danger to humanity. It's our job to kill Mwagwe. Fen protested, her body almost flickering like she itched to shift. You'd better not be growing soft on me, Shangdi. His gaze slid past her to the opposite bank, where a long yellow tail flicked beneath a bush. The blue one wasn't even hiding, but coiled around a tree trunk in the open. Its scales gleamed sapphire, glittering in the sunlight. So beautiful.
We're in the middle of nowhere,
Shang retorted.
They're not endangering humanity here.
But what if they're free to breed uncontrolled? Their population will explode. They will terrorize and kill any traveler come this way. Fen's hand gripped her knife hilt with the tightly coiled patience of a huntress. I can kill them quickly. The panda batted a paw toward the knife, leaning its chubby head closer to sniff it.
There's no need,
Shang repeated with a glare.
It's more trouble than it's worth.
Or perhaps he suffered more from his injuries than he let on? Fen's lips pulled back from her teeth in a snarl, but she stayed put. They rode for several long minutes in silence. Meiling hated that every time she was angry at Shang, he did something like this that made her not dislike him as much as she wanted to. Despite the burning in her chest whenever she remembered what his words implied about her mother, she couldn't help but be thankful for his intervention against Fen's bloodlust. Hopefully, they wouldn't stumble across any more dragons. But then Fen's eyes suddenly locked on the back of Shang's head. She ripped the knot free of the sash tying the panda to her chest, leaned to the side, and dumped Bo in Meiling's lap. Then she folded into a hawk, leaping into the air, and flew back the way they'd come. Her horse continued walking as if it did not notice the lack of rider or the sudden slack of reins. "No!" Meiling cried, wrapping her arms around the cub's flailing limbs before it fell off the horse. "Shang, we have to stop her!" Shang said nothing, merely shot a dark look where Fen had disappeared and tightened his fists around his reins. Why didn't he do something? He was the only one who had any measure of control over her. Meiling turned her horse around, clutching Bo tighter to her.
"What are you doing?"
Shang demanded. "She can't just kill them! They didn't hurt anything!" she cried, surprised by her own force of will and emotion. She was about to kick her horse into a gallop, but Shang reached over and deftly snatched her reins from her hands.
"It's too late,"
he said.
"You can't stop her."
"I can try!" But even as she spoke, the hawk came flying back. It hovered over the saddle and then folded back into that tall young woman. Fen said nothing, only plopped back like nothing had happened. Her back was straight, a tiny, self-satisfied hint of a smile playing on her lips. "Thanks for holding him," she said, as she peeled Bo from Meiling's arms and pulled him into her lap. Shang dropped her reins, and they all continued riding. Meiling stared with utter disgust at Fen. She let her horse fall a little further behind her companions. Or was companion too warm a word for them? As they rode, she couldn't help but shed a tear.
"We have to cross eventually,"
Shang was saying reasonably. And Fen was responding impetuously. "Let's cross later. Maybe it'll lighten up downstream."
"Unlikely,"
Shang said.
"Too much farther, and we'll be traveling outside our way. Besides, you won't have to get wet. Only the rest of us."
"Why can't you freeze a bridge for us?" Meiling asked. Fen choked on a laugh.
"It would flood the area and prove counterproductive,"
Shang said, too simply. "Besides," Fen said, chortling a little, "with your luck, you'd slip and fall in anyway." Meiling glared at her back, swallowing the anger rising in her throat, burning her tongue. With effort, she drew in a deep breath and let it out between clenched teeth. She shouldn't let herself be ruffled by Fen's comments. But they were just so unnecessary and so rude. Shang looked at Meiling, and something sparked in his eyes. She couldn't make out what, but it seemed negative. Was that disapproval directed at Fen or Meiling?
"I'll go first with Fen's horse. You follow,"
he said. "On my horse?" Meiling asked. Fen smirked. "Unless you want to swim." Then she dumped a squirming Bo in Meiling's arms. Meiling kept her horse at bay while Fen folded into a hawk and flew across. She landed as a human, and Meiling still couldn't quite make her brain understand what happened when she shifted. Shang already held Fen's lead in his hand and waded into the stream, guiding both horses after him. Fen's horse planted its hooves on the bank, and Shang growled at it while pulling harder on the lead. His horse flattened its ears, but obeyed. Meiling followed hesitantly, quickly discovering the water was much deeper than she expected. Shang wasn't even halfway before his robes and trousers were soaked to his thighs, and by the time he reached the middle, he was waist deep. The horses put their ears back, whinnying nervously.
"Follow!"
Shang barked at Meiling. She took a deep breath and urged her horse deeper. The mare tossed her head, ears back, and stamped her front hoof. "Come on, my pretty girl," Meiling soothed. It's only a little stream. Keep going. That's it. The water was shockingly cold as it enveloped her feet. She tried to hold her feet up so they did not get wet, but after a few more painful steps deeper, it proved impossible, especially with Bo trying to eat her arm. She let her feet fall and seize up from the cold. She drew deep, steadying breaths and kept softly coaxing her horse in further. Of course, Shang didn't flinch from the icy water. Half his body must be numb now that he was almost to the other side. He glanced over his shoulder.
Move faster!
Meiling glared at his back. Something flashed in front of her. She instinctively ducked, dropping the reins to shield her face from claws and clutching her arm tighter around the cub, but realized it was only Fen in hawk form. It screeched as though amused it startled her. Then it dove back in, snatching up a squawking Bo in its talons, presumably to carry him to shore. Meiling's horse, however, was not amused. Before she could grasp at the reins again, before she could scream, before she could even catch a breath, her horse reared and shrieked in terror. Meiling flailed her arms, scrabbling desperately for purchase and finding none. She tumbled off the saddle into the rushing, freezing river. Cold stunned her body. She plunged into the swift currents, smashing her back into something hard, knocking air out of her chest. Breathe! She needed to breathe! Her limbs turned to lead, stiffened almost beyond use. She frantically clawed at the water, her eyes opened desperately wide and freezing in their sockets. She was going to die. This was death. A panicked, wretched... Something pulled tight around her neck, nearly choking her and making her last reserves of air gush into bubbles. Had her cloak caught on something? She was buried beneath the pressure of the rushing water over her head. She couldn't rise. Panic overwhelmed her. And then, air. She gasped, choked, coughed up water. Something warm held her tight as the icy current swirled around her. She coughed again, into Shang's chest. Then she became aware that he was shouting. At Fen. She could only suck in lungful after lungful of blessed air and clutch fistfuls of Shang's tunic. One of his arms held her against him, while the other gripped his horse's saddle to keep them both from being swept away. They moved slowly toward the shore, where Fen was back in human form, reaching to pull Shang's horse out of the currents.
Don't bother getting your boots wet.
Shang snarled at her when they were finally nearing the bank. He released his horse and bent, scooping up Meiling out of the water to carry her to shore. She trembled with cold, completely soaked head to toe, but all she could think about was how wonderful each breath was in her lungs. She clung to Shang, breathed heaving gulps of air. The water fell away with each step until they were on the dry-ish, ground. He lowered his hold under her knees to allow her to stand. But as she tried to gain her balance, his wide hand planted on her head and pushed down. Pushing her onto a rock to sit, she realized when she hit it hard. She chattered, wrapping her arms tightly around her middle.
Your cloak,
Shang ordered Fen, while angrily bending to unfasten Meiling's. His hands were ice blocks fumbling at her throat. He peeled away the wet cloak and snatched Fen's cloak from her outstretched hand. Not gently at all, he wrapped the dry cloak around Meiling. This done, he whirled on Fen.
What were you thinking?
He exploded.
You compromise our mission. Do you realize the girl could have died? Do you realize our lives would have been forfeited? I don't care how stupid you think this assignment is. You will not allow your feelings to hinder your duty. Understand?
It's not my fault that her horse was spooked, Fen shot back. I had to get the panda. At the mention of her horse, Meiling glanced over to see all three horses safely on dry land. Fen was soaked to her waist. She had retrieved the horses while Shang saved Meiling.
Did you expect to do something stupid and get a pleasant outcome?
Shang snarled mercilessly.
I don't care about the panda, and if you are determined to let it interfere with your duty, I will get rid of it. Don't tell me it's injured and it needs your help. The daughter of your emperor is in your care. And while we're on the subject of duty, you need to stop being so cruel to her. Enough with it all, Fen.
I don't see you bowing to her and praising her grace and majesty. Shang stepped closer to Fen, water dripping from his clenched jaw, the darkness of his eyes sucking the sunlight out of the world. And Fen, to Meiling's shock, actually stumbled back a step.
I don't care if you hate her or if you hate this mission,
said Shang, dropping his voice to a low, menacing rumble.
I don't care if you're a dragon-blasted shifter with a temper you can't control. Learn to control yourself, Hu Fen. You'll be the death of us all unless you stop putting your feelings ahead of your duty.
Fen stared at him, eyes wide and flashing with hurt. Then she whirled on her heel, huffing as she stormed toward her horse, scooping up the panda on her way. Shang's glare didn't shift away from her. Meiling's teeth chattered, and she pulled Fen's dry cloak tight around her wet shoulders. Her back ached where she'd hit the rock, but she got to her feet. Should we be moving? She stuttered. Without waiting for their response, she walked on stiff legs to her horse. Did she have the strength to mount? She looked back to find Shang and Fen both staring at her. We are traveling more today, right? She asked, one eyebrow raised. Shang strode toward her, not looking her in the eye, and offered her a boost into the saddle. Fen mounted, also refusing to meet her gaze. The rest of the day, they traveled in silence and wet clothes. Chapter 12. Thanks to the warm, bright sun, Meiling was mostly dry by the time they stopped the camp, except where she'd been sitting on the saddle. Shang left her to dismount herself, apparently confident in her recovery from her earlier swim. Fen took care of settling the horses for the night, Shang assembled the tent, and Meiling busied herself lighting the fire while the panda laid on its back beside her, munching on bamboo. No one spoke for a long time, not until Fen shoved Meiling's cloak into her face. "Take your smelly cloak and give me mine," she growled. Meiling stopped arranging the stick she'd collected to unfasten the clasp around her neck and pull the cloak away from around her shoulders. She held it out to Fen, meeting her eyes. Fen looked away quickly. She snatched the cloak and turned on her heel. So she did feel guilty. Meiling braved a glance at Shang. He was focused, his brow relaxed, as he fastened the corners of the canvas tent to the stakes. But the tension in his shoulders told her he was a tightly coiled spring, ready to burst forth at any provocation. He finished his work and looked up, catching her studying him. She did not let her gaze flee away, but instead held his firmly. "Let me look at your shoulder," she said. When he looked like he was about to refuse, she added, "A little more salve will help with the pain, and you'll need fresh bandages after the river today." His eyes were so dark in the twilight. He didn't say no, which she took as a yes. She scrambled to her feet to fetch the supplies, and returned to find Shang had set himself near the unfinished fire, awaiting her ministrations. Did she mistake the line of pain in his face? Perhaps the thought of relief was more than he could bear after hiding the pain all day. "Let me start the fire," she said, setting the pack of medical supplies next to Shang. "It'll give me better light to work by." He said nothing. Then distributed water skins, strips of jerky and rice cakes, then sat down across Shang, quietly watching Meiling strike the steel on the flint. With both of their eyes on her, she dared not be so careless as to injure herself again. Even as she struck the metal and rock, her fingers throbbed in fear of another biting incision. Bo rolled around behind her, tangling his paws in the folds of her cloaks. Little squeaks punctuated his movements, and by now he'd almost chewed through his bandage. He seemed to be healing very quickly. Did that mean they'd have to release him back to the wild soon? Eventually, the fire crackled and gained strength. The horses chewed noisily nearby, mingling with the familiar sounds of the night. Singing bugs, the swoosh of a gentle breeze rustling leaves overhead, and Meiling could easily imagine the stars' whispers above her. She approached Shang where he sat, the fire hot at her back, and knelt next to him. For a split second, his eyes met hers, and she hesitated, chewed the inside of her cheek. Then he looked away and shrugged out of his outer robes, undoing the front laces of his tunic. Carefully, as though the movement brought pain, he pulled the neckline to one side, over his bandaged shoulder. There was the tiniest flash of a wince on his face, but he masked it quickly. "I'm going to unwrap the bandage," she murmured softly, shifting so she could better see by the firelight. She had removed the bandages on her fingers earlier. They were so wet and had served their purpose, so she worked with no impediment. When she pulled back the last layer of bandage, her fingers brushed his skin, and he shivered. Probably from the bandage finally peeling away from the wound, or the startling cold of her fingers. It was hard to see clearly in the firelight, but she told him what she saw. "It's a little pale, puckered in some areas. A couple of the blisters burst, but it is looking much better than yesterday." She attempted a reassuring smile. He wasn't looking. She continued her work, pulling out the salve. "I will apply the salve now." He did nothing except stare into the fire, but with each application, his body tensed beneath her rubbing fingers. A muscle in his neck, then jaw, twitched as she moved closer to the blisters. "There," she announced with another missed smile. "I'll rebind it. It should feel much better in the morning." The fire itself popped much louder than she spoke, and Bo had snuggled next to Fenn's boot. If she did not hover near his ear, she would think he could not hear her soft whispers. She cut a long stretch of bandage, and Shang obliged to pull the neck of his tunic over a little more so she could loop the soft gauze under his arm and over his shoulder. "Done." She tied the knot, her tongue stuck into her cheek. She pulled away, and he readjusted his tunic. "What about the other one? It should be much better." Face still tight and expressionless, he rolled up his sleeve where the other bandage was bound around his forearm. When she pulled it away, it was so much improved that she announced he shouldn't need another bandage for it. She did take his forearm in both of her hands, though, turning it upward, and gently worked more salve into the area. Once she was done, she packed the supplies back into their pack. The top of her bent head prickled, as though in response to his gaze following her movements. She looked up, found him staring at her. She almost frowned at the strange way the fire gleamed in his dark pupils. But she snapped shut the kit and stood. She froze at his voice. "I know you're hiding something," he whispered, his voice edged in darkness and low enough that only she could hear. She stood, stunned. Her breath escaped her lips in a whoosh, her eyes widening. He knew about her magic, or suspected it. And what would he do if he found out? Would he expose her before the courts to get his appointment back? Expose her father as a liar? Would her secret magic bring a centuries-old dynasty to its knees? She shot a glance at Fen, who seemed completely absorbed in sharpening her knife and ignoring the panda chewing on the top of her boots. Meiling's mouth opened, but she clamped it shut. There was nothing she could say to Shang, not when he looked at her like his hunted prey. Wordlessly, she turned around and carried the pack to the horse, silently fuming as she went. This was how he repaid her kindness? What happened to him telling Fen to stop treating her cruelly? She was tired of this, sick of the way they constantly reminded her that she was less because she hadn't gone to the academy, hadn't touched a weapon in her life, because she was forced to keep her magic a secret. Stalking back into the ring of firelight, she crossed her arms over her chest and asked boldly, "Shang, would you teach me self-defense? In case we're attacked again?" Fen's eyes went the size of saucers. Her eyebrows shot up, and she turned her surprised gaze from Meiling to Shang. "Teach you? You'd do more damage to yourself if you knew anything." Shang's cool eyes slid from Meiling's determined brow to Fen's mockery. When he looked at Fen, something flashed in his eyes. Anger at her words, or a desire for revenge? Would he train her to spite Fen? Her hopes rose. But he shook his head and returned his gaze to the fire.
Nothing you could learn in the span of a few short evenings would be helpful. Fen's right. A little training would pose more danger than anything else.
Perhaps he decided he preferred to spite Meiling by refusing to help her. That, judging by the ever so slight lift of the corner of his mouth, was very possible. Or maybe he genuinely did not think she could learn anything of use in so short a time. "Leave the fighting to us," Fen said, her voice too eager. In the flickering flames, she suddenly took on a wolfish sort of grin. Meiling could have sworn those fangs reappeared. "May I have a small weapon at least?" she pressed. The illusionist, Shang, was shaking his head again, not letting his eyes stray from the dancing fire. Then he seemed to reconsider, and he shrugged. He reached into his sleeve and extracted a small penknife.
"Here."
Fen howled with laughter. The panda barked in response, scooting away from her. Meiling accepted it with heated cheeks, sliding it up her own sleeve. "Thank you," she managed to mumble, despite how fat the words weighed on her tongue. It had grown so much darker in a matter of minutes. The last light of dusk had fled away, leaving the heaviness of midnight, despite the early hour. Meiling retreated into her tent, Fen's laughter still ringing in her hot ears. The moment she moved back the flap, she cursed herself for not getting her bedroll. She was surprised to discover that Shang had already arranged it for her. Cocking her head, she let the tent flap fall closed behind her. Exhaustion grappled at her, tangling in her hair, reaching for her mind. And she was strangely cold. Not bothering to undress, she snuggled into her cloak and blanket on the bedroll and fell fast asleep. She hovered over the campsite, watching Fen talk to Shang. Fen kept reminding him of various funny or shocking stories from academy days, definitely an attempt to weasel her way back into his good graces. "Remember when that good-for-nothing Jitsa challenged you to a duel because the girl he liked had set her sights on you? And then you demolished him?" Fen laughed.
"Was that why he challenged me? I thought he just wanted to practice with me,"
Shang said.
"Who was the girl?"
"Li Feiyan, the healer. You did not know she liked you?" The kind girl who had spoken to Meiling at the graduation festival? He shrugged.
"I knew of her. Everyone was excited about her. First healer in ages. What was she, a year behind us?"
"Aye, though she should have been 2 years behind us. They accelerated and abbreviated her training so she could serve the people while still at the academy. She was always busy. The panda curled up by the fire, always near Fen, and fell asleep. Story after story passed, for as headstrong and impulsive as Fen was, she knew Shang, much better than Meiling did. With each story Fen told, she stroked his ego. They were stories about Shang winning a battle, outsmarting a classmate, one even of a prank Fen had tried to get Shang to join. He'd said he did not have time and could not risk getting in trouble. But then the prank went off without a slip, apparently thanks to some evanescer named Kai, and the masters never knew about it. The way Fen spoke about it, it was clearly one of her most proud accomplishments. Then the direction of the conversation shifted. "I never expected this to be our first assignment," Fen said, sourness edging her words. Shang didn't respond, but there was no denying what the clenching of his jaw meant. He was still angry about losing his appointment, despite how he tried not to show it. "I curse the day she was born without magic. Just because the Emperor wants to keep her tainted reputation far away from the prince does not mean our lives have to be ruined," Fen growled. A jolt went through Meiling's spirit. That was what they thought this was? A ploy to separate her scorn from her honored brother? It was nothing like that. Or... No. Meiling would not give voice to the terrible thoughts swirling in her mind. Her parents never lied to her. They might withhold information, but they would never lie. She found herself sinking closer to the ground, and her presence shrunk into a small, dense mass. She listened as the conversation descended even further. If only she wasn't so annoying. Fen held her knife to the fire, turning it this way and that to see the flames reflecting in its gleaming blade. Pompous, superior, and so judgmental. She tries to sound smart and sweet by asking so many questions, and then she's utterly helpless. Not only in battle, but she couldn't even mount a horse or start a fire. Have you noticed how long it takes her to light the fire? She moves so slowly, as if the wood must be just so. Shang was staring at the fire without speaking. But when she mentioned the horse and the fire, his lips pursed ruefully. It was as though Fen's dagger plunged straight into Meiling's heart. "Here, Shang!" Fen stood up, mimicking Meiling's soft voice. It came out ridiculous, stilted, and harsh from her mouth. "Let me care for your wound." She tossed her hair over her shoulder and batted her eyelashes. Shang said nothing, ignoring her. Then Fen said, "It would be so easy to pack up and leave her here. She'd become dragon food before mid-morning. Or we could watch your tongue. Our lives are forfeit if harm befalls the girl." Shang interrupted. "Do not speak of ways to dispatch her. I don't want to hear any more of your complaints about her." "You can't stop a girl from dreaming." Fen grinned wickedly. "Here, I'll take first watch." Meiling drew back when Shang approached the tent to sprawl out in front like previously. Fen kept her knife out, twirling it dangerously in her fingers, staring at the surrounding area. Every few minutes, her gaze dropped to Bo, sleeping by her boots. Your gift, Ma had called her magic. It was her curse. A curse deeper than the shame she bore. Here she had been, thinking they had made progress in their relationship. Shang did not trust her, but she had thought herself of some use. Helpful. They spoke like she only served to slow them down. Pompous? Superior? Judgmental? Those were severe charges indeed. Meiling might have had trouble breathing through her pained, constricted chest if she were in a physical body. But she was a spirit and could not feel those physical symptoms of distress. Instead, all she could feel was an aching, throbbing heart. She floated away from the fire, away from Shang, away from Fen. She fled as far as she could go, as high as she could fly, until her soul tether pulled taut, stopping her flight. Pulling at it, she wheeled back and lurched forward, tried to claw her way further, to disappear into the stars and never wake up again. It was fruitless. She couldn't break the tether, couldn't lose herself in the midnight sky. It hurt. It hurt very much, possibly more than anything else she had experienced. It should not hurt her. Their opinions of her did not really matter. They could think what they wanted. But their opinions did matter. Their words did hurt her. And as she floated, suspended above the world, so far away from those glistening diamonds above, a temptation grew so great it nearly overwhelmed her. This was how people grew hard, cold, unfeeling. They were hurt, and as a result, they pulled away. Brick by brick, they built wall after wall of disappointment, fear, and resentment. She could almost feel the brick and mortar in her shadow hands. It would be so easy. But she could not escape the memory of her mother, Ma, the elegant and stern queen of the emperor. She was not hard and cold. She was brave. Then there was her younger sister, pretty, fierce little Hao. She loved as fiercely as she fought at the academy. Could Meiling let herself become hardened when she still had a little sister to love? What would Hao learn if Meiling began building walls around her heart? She didn't want to be hurt. She also didn't want to be hardened. What if she returned to her family after these months, only to find that she was a completely different person, and not in a better way? She thought of Fen and Shang. Their personalities were very different, but they both harbored a deep cynicism about life. So much doubt, distrust, and coldness. Perhaps they did not think so. Perhaps they ought to be so for their careers. Meiling did not want to be like that. The fight in her soul melted into a sad sort of determination, a resolve. She let the imagined bricks and mortar fall out of her hands. She refused to believe that strength was only found in physical might and supernatural powers. Value didn't come only from utility. She refused to close her heart to the beauty that was still very much present in the world, in this empire. Meiling let her vision trail along the landscape below her, blanketed in thick darkness. There were the mountains they skirted, so high, jutting, craggy, and black. There was the valley, stretching as far as she could see. Forest, fields, and farmlands. She closed her eyes and imagined sitting on her cliff back home, overlooking the ocean. Never had she suspected how she would ache for that view. Being away from her family, how much longer could she go on without them? Perhaps this would have been easier with kinder protectors, but it hardly mattered. She missed her siblings, her parents, and each echo of Fen's word and glimmers of Shang's twisted lips in her mind drove a knife further into her homesick heart. Suddenly, a fiery orange glow blinked a long way away, catching her eye and causing her heart to lurch. Meiling tugged on her tether and realized it ran straight to that glow. Her soul plummeted. Mwagwe!